Let's talk about what might be the darkest South Park theory ever, Kenny's immortality curse. You ever wonder why Kenny keeps dying over and over and nobody seems to care? There's actually a really disturbing explanation for what's happening to him, and it's way worse than just bad luck or comedy violence. Kenny isn't just dying and coming back for laughs. He's trapped in an eternal suffering loop where he remembers every single death, but his friends forget each time. Think about what that means for a second. Kenny has died over 98 times throughout the series. He's been crushed, exploded, burned alive, impaled, electrocuted, and killed in basically every horrible way you can imagine. And he remembers all of it. The Mysterian episodes prove this beyond any doubt. When Kenny becomes Mysterian, he explicitly tells the other kids that he dies all the time and always comes back the next day. He says he's been asking his parents about it since he was a little kid, trying to understand why this keeps happening to him. But here's the really messed up part. His friends hear him say this and immediately forget. Stan, Kyle, and Cartman just move on like Kenny never said anything, which proves that whatever curse Kenny is under also makes everyone else forget each cycle. This is exactly what psychological torture would look like. Kenny is completely alone in his suffering because nobody else can remember or acknowledge what's happening to him. Every time he dies, he experiences the full pain and terror of death. Then he wakes up the next morning and has to go to school like nothing happened, watching his best friends act like yesterday never occurred. That's genuine psychological horror. In Coon versus Coon and Friends, we find out why this is happening to Kenny. His parents are members of a Cthulhu cult, and they attended cult meetings where they made deals with dark forces. The curse on Kenny is directly connected to his parents' involvement with this cosmic horror cult. They basically sacrifice their son's sanity and peace for whatever benefits the cult promised them. Kenny is paying the price for his parents' choices, forced into eternal rebirth because of rituals he had no control over. What makes this even more disturbing is Kenny's family situation. The McCormicks are the poorest family in South Park. They live in a broken-down house, can barely afford food, and Kenny's parents are constantly fighting. Some people think this poverty is just comedy, but what if it's actually part of the curse? Cosmic punishment for making dark deals? Kenny's entire family is trapped in poverty and dysfunction because of what his parents did, but Kenny got the worst of it because he's the one who has to die over and over. Think about Kenny's muffled voice behind his hood. Most people assume it's just a comedy gag where we can't understand what he's saying. But what if it's actually symbolic of how nobody listens to him? Kenny is literally being silenced by the show's format. His voice is muffled, his deaths are forgotten, and his suffering is treated as a joke. He's screaming for help behind that orange parka, but nobody can hear him or remember him long enough to actually help. The psychological damage Kenny must have is beyond comprehension. He's watched himself die in horrific ways nearly 100 times. He's experienced the terror of knowing death is coming and being unable to stop it. He's felt his body being destroyed in every possible way, and then he has to wake up and pretend everything is fine while his friends make jokes and live normal lives. Normal people would lose their minds after one death experience, but Kenny has been through this cycle hundreds of times. His superhero identity as Mysterian makes way more sense now, too. Kenny becomes a vigilante who fights crime and tries to help people because it's the only way he can find meaning in his cursed existence. If he's going to die over and over anyway, he might as well try to save people and use his immortality for something good. But even that gets twisted because he's still dying horrible deaths, just now with the added weight of trying to be heroic while suffering eternally. The really tragic part is that Kenny probably started out as a normal, happy kid before he was old enough to understand what was happening to him. Somewhere in his early childhood, he realized he was trapped in this cycle and that nobody would ever remember or help him. Imagine being a little kid and discovering that you're cosmically cursed to die forever while everyone you love forgets you existed. That would break anyone. Throughout the series, Kenny shows signs of depression and detachment that make perfect sense if he's carrying the weight of remembering every death. He's quieter than the other kids, less invested in their drama, and often seems like he's just going through the motions. That's someone who's given up on finding escape and is just surviving day by day, knowing another horrible death is coming soon. If this theory is true, then Kenny isn't just unlucky or a comedy device. He's trapped in the worst psychological torture imaginable. Every death, every rebirth, every time his friends forget him is another layer of hell he can't escape from. And the worst part? He's fully aware of all of it. He's a kid carrying the memory of nearly 100 deaths while pretending to be normal so his friends don't think he's crazy. That's genuinely horrifying when you think about it. Let's examine this really disturbing theory about Butters. What if his sweet, innocent personality isn't natural at all, but actually a survival response to constant abuse? Think about it for a second. Butters is known as the nicest, most polite kid in South Park. He apologizes for everything, never gets angry, and always tries to see the good in people. But that's not normal childhood behavior. That's trauma response behavior. Butters' very own episode gives us the smoking gun for this. Theory: his mom, Linda, literally tries to murder him. She drives him to a river, makes him close his eyes, and attempts to drown him because she's having a mental breakdown about her husband's affairs. When that fails, she tries to drive them both off a bridge. Most shows would treat attempted child murder as a serious crime, but South Park just has Butters forgive her, and everything goes back to normal by the next episode. Here's the thing about that episode. Butters' reaction to his mom trying to kill him is telling. He doesn't fight back, doesn't scream for help, doesn't report her to authorities. He just accepts it and tries to make sense of why his mom would do this. That's classic abuse victim mentality. He's been conditioned to accept whatever his parents do to him and find ways to blame himself instead of recognizing the abuse. Throughout the series, we see Stephen Butters beating his son for the smallest infractions. In Jared Has AIDS, Stephen takes off his belt and beats Butters on camera. The show plays it for laughs, but think about what's actually happening. A grown man is violently hitting a child with a weapon. That's not discipline, that's assault, and it happens constantly throughout the series. The groundings are even more disturbing when you analyze the pattern. Butters gets grounded for things that aren't his fault, things that are completely outside his control, or things that aren't even real problems. He gets grounded for being in a commercial without permission, for other kids' behavior, for accidents, for literally nothing. This is textbook controlling behavior where abusive parents punish children arbitrarily to maintain psychological dominance. Look at how Butters reacts to being grounded. He doesn't argue, doesn't defend himself, doesn't point out the unfairness. He just accepts it immediately and apologizes even when he did nothing wrong. Normal kids would push back or get angry, but Butters has learned that resistance only makes things worse. He's been trained through repeated punishment to be completely submissive. The Ungroundable shows another layer of this abuse. Butters gets locked in the basement as punishment, which is literally isolation torture. Locking a child in a dark basement alone is psychological abuse that creates lasting trauma. But Butters' parents do this regularly as their standard punishment method. They're systematically using isolation to control their son's behavior through fear. What makes this even darker is that Butters' parents present themselves as normal, religious, upstanding citizens. They go to church, follow social rules, and act like they're good people. This is exactly how abuse works in real families. The abusers maintain a public image of respectability while terrorizing their children in private. Nobody suspects the Butters family because they look so normal from the outside. Professor Chaos becomes way more significant when you understand it as Butters' only outlet for his repressed rage and trauma. He can't express anger at home because it would result in more punishment. He can't express it at school because he's been conditioned to be submissive, so he creates this alter ego where he can finally be aggressive and powerful instead of constantly victimized. Professor Chaos isn't comedy. It's a child's desperate attempt to reclaim some sense of control over his life. The really messed up part is how Butters' trauma gets weaponized by other kids. Cartman constantly manipulates him, uses him for schemes, and treats him like garbage. Butters accepts this treatment because it's familiar. Kids from abusive homes often end up in abusive friendships because that's the only relationship dynamic they understand. Cartman recognized that Butters is an easy target and exploits his trained submissiveness constantly. Butters' constant optimism and niceness start looking really different when you realize it's a trauma response. He's not naturally sweet. He's performing sweetness as a survival strategy. Being nice, being polite, being apologetic are all ways to minimize punishment from his parents. He's learned that the nicer he is, the less likely they are to hurt him. That's not innocence. That's a scared kid doing whatever he can to survive. The episode where Butters thinks he's a vampire shows how deep his damage goes. He's so desperate to belong somewhere, to be something other than the abused kid, that he'll latch onto any identity that gives him purpose. Whether it's Professor Chaos, a vampire, or whatever role someone assigns him, Butters keeps trying to find an identity that isn't defined by being his parents' victim. His relationship with his dad is particularly toxic. Steven projects his own issues onto Butters constantly. He's paranoid about Butters being gay, forces him into masculine activities, and punishes him for not meeting impossible standards. This is a father who sees his son as an extension of himself rather than as an individual person. Every time Butters fails to meet these standards, Steven responds with violence and punishment. Linda's role is just as abusive, but in a different way. She enables Steven's violence, tries to murder Butters herself, and manipulates him emotionally. In some episodes, she pretends to be the nice parent who protects Butters from Steven, but then she turns around and punishes him just as harshly. This inconsistency creates confusion, where Butters never knows which version of his mom he's going to get, keeping him in a constant state of anxiety. This theory transforms Butters from a funny, innocent character into a traumatized child using toxic positivity to survive domestic violence. Every time we laugh at him getting grounded or beaten, we're actually watching ongoing child abuse disguised as comedy. His cheerful personality isn't natural childhood innocence. It's a mask he wears to survive parents who hurt him physically, emotionally, and psychologically on a daily basis. The show is documenting severe child abuse and framing it as entertainment, which might be the darkest joke South Park has ever told. Here's a theory that changes everything about South Park. What if the town itself isn't actually a real place, but some kind of purgatory where terrible people are trapped forever? Think about the fundamental structure of the show for a minute. Nothing ever permanently changes. Characters never grow or learn. Extreme events happen and then get completely forgotten by the next episode. That's not normal continuity issues. That's the mechanics of eternal punishment. You ever notice how nobody in South Park actually leaves? Characters talk about moving away, they pack their bags, they get in cars, and drive off. But they always come back. Always. Chef is the most obvious example. He leaves South Park, gets brainwashed by a cult, comes back, and then dies when he tries to leave again. The show literally killed off a character because he tried to escape. That's not coincidence. That's enforcement of the prison rules. The reset button nature of the show supports this theory completely. Major disasters happen constantly. Aliens invade, celebrities die, buildings explode, the entire town gets destroyed. But by the next episode, everything is back to normal with no explanation. Nobody talks about the alien invasion that happened last week. Nobody mentions the celebrity who got murdered in their town. It all just resets like it never happened, forcing everyone to repeat their cycles of bad behavior over and over. This is exactly what eternal punishment would look like. Hell isn't fire and torture. It's being trapped in the same place with the same people, making the same mistakes forever. The residents of South Park can't grow, can't change, can't escape their worst impulses because they're cosmically prevented from doing so. They're stuck in a loop where every lesson gets forgotten and every mistake gets repeated. Look at the adults in South Park. Every single one of them is morally bankrupt in some fundamental way. Randy is an alcoholic narcissist. Stephen Butters is an abusive control freak. Leanne Cartman enables her sociopath son. The parents are all terrible people who consistently make the worst possible choices. What if they're in South Park specifically because they're terrible people? What if this is where souls go when they're too morally compromised for heaven, but not evil enough for traditional hell. The kids being trapped there makes the theory even darker. They're suffering for their parents' sins. Stan, Kyle, Cartman, and Kenny didn't do anything to deserve punishment, but they're stuck in this purgatory town because of what their parents did in their previous lives or in their early lives before the show started. The kids are collateral damage in a cosmic justice system that punishes entire families. South Park's isolation is another major clue. The town is in Colorado, but it might as well be on another planet for how disconnected it is from the rest of the world. Major historical events barely touch them. National news happens around them, but rarely affects them directly. They exist in this bubble where normal rules don't apply and impossible things happen constantly. It's not a quirky small town. It's a pocket dimension outside normal reality. The celebrity deaths are particularly telling. Celebrities visit South Park and die there all the time, but after they die, nobody in the outside world mentions it. The celebrities just disappear from existence, and life goes on like they never existed. This suggests that South Park exists in some kind of separate reality where deaths don't transfer back to the real world, or maybe the celebrities who come to South Park are already dead, and this is their purgatory too. Here's where it gets really messed up. The extreme events that happen constantly, aliens, monsters, natural disasters, magical events, are all part of the punishment. The residents are forced to live through impossible horrors that would traumatize normal people, but they can't be traumatized because they reset. They have to experience the terror over and over without building up tolerance or coping mechanisms. Every disaster is fresh trauma that gets wiped clean so they can experience it again. The town's weird physics support this theory too. Fire works underwater. Snow appears and disappears randomly. Buildings get destroyed and rebuild themselves. Time moves inconsistently. These aren't animation shortcuts. They're evidence that South Park operates under different physical laws than the real world because it's a constructed punishment dimension. Mr. Garrison's multiple identity changes make sense in this context. He's trying desperately to find a version of himself that can escape the punishment, but it doesn't work. Gay, straight, trans, man, woman, it doesn't matter because he's trapped regardless of identity. His constant transformations are futile attempts to break free from a system that won't let him leave. The show's self-awareness adds another layer to this theory. Characters occasionally reference being in episodes or seasons. They talk about how things worked in previous seasons. They're aware on some level that they're trapped in a repeating narrative, which makes the punishment even more cruel. Imagine knowing you're stuck in a loop but being unable to stop it or escape. Throughout the entire series, we see attempts at growth and redemption fail systematically. Anytime a character tries to become better, the show punishes them for it. Stan tries to be moral and ends up depressed. Kyle tries to do the right thing and gets mocked. Even when characters have breakthrough moments of understanding, it's all erased by the next episode. The system is designed to prevent improvement. Randy's increasingly erratic behavior across seasons shows what happens to souls trapped in purgatory for too long. He's not getting wackier for comedy. He's losing his grip on sanity after years of repeating the same cycles. His schemes get more desperate and insane because he's subconsciously trying to break free from the pattern, but nothing works. He's trapped in a downward spiral that can never hit bottom because there is no bottom in purgatory. The religious imagery throughout the show reinforces this theory. Satan appears regularly and seems to be managing something. God exists but is distant and uncaring. Jesus lives in South Park but can't actually help anyone. Heaven and hell are both real, which means purgatory must exist somewhere in between. South Park is that in-between place where souls wait and suffer. If South Park is purgatory, then every episode is another cycle of punishment where these souls are forced to be their worst selves over and over. They can't grow, can't leave, can't escape their fundamental nature. Stan will always be the depressed voice of reason who fails to fix anything. Kyle will always be the self-righteous kid who can't save everyone. Cartman will always be evil. The adults will always be terrible parents. And the whole town will keep spinning through disasters and resets until the end of time, which in purgatory never comes. You ever wonder why Cartman is so much worse than just a mean kid? There's actually a really dark explanation for his behavior that suggests he's a genuine psychopath in development. Most kids are cruel sometimes, but Cartman's cruelty operates on a completely different level. He's not just bullying people or being bratty. He's exhibiting textbook sociopathic behavior that will likely escalate into serial killer territory as he gets older. Scott to Norman Must Die is the episode that proves Cartman isn't just a cartoon villain. He literally feeds a teenager his own parents after grinding them into chili. Think about the level of planning that required. Cartman had to orchestrate Scott's parents' deaths, harvest their bodies, process them into meat, cook them into chili, and then serve it to Scott while watching him eat his own parents. That's not a prank gone wrong. That's premeditated murder, followed by psychological torture. But here's the really disturbing part. Cartman shows zero remorse. After Scott breaks down crying and discovers what happened, Cartman doesn't feel guilty. He feels satisfied. He licks Scott's tears off his face because he's literally feeding off the suffering he caused. Normal people would be horrified by what they did. Psychopaths get pleasure from it. The lack of empathy is documented across hundreds of episodes. Cartman can watch people suffer and feel nothing except annoyance if their suffering inconveniences him. He's faked disabilities to win the Special Olympics. He's started riots and conflicts that got people killed. He's manipulated his friends into dangerous situations for his own benefit. And through all of it, he never shows genuine remorse or understanding of why his actions are wrong. Liane's enabling created the perfect environment for a sociopath to develop without any behavioral correction. She gives Cartman whatever he wants, refuses to discipline him, and validates his worst impulses. When Cartman does something terrible, Liane either ignores it or makes excuses for him. She's essentially raising a psychopath by removing every consequence that might teach him empathy or self-control. The missing father figure makes everything worse. Cartman has no male authority in his life to provide boundaries or model appropriate behavior. In episodes where his father's identity comes up, it's revealed to be either Mr. Garrison or his own mother through some hermaphrodite situation. Either way, Cartman has no stable father figure, which means he never learned how to process emotions in healthy ways or respect authority. This creates a void where normal moral development should happen. His schemes show advanced predatory planning that goes way beyond normal childhood mischief. Cartman can manipulate entire groups of people, create elaborate cons, and predict how others will react to his provocations. He understands psychology well enough to exploit it. That's high-level strategic thinking combined with complete amorality. It's exactly how serial killers operate before they start killing. Look at his racism, anti-Semitism, and general bigotry. These aren't just offensive jokes. They're evidence of his inability to see other people as fully human. Cartman genuinely believes he's superior to everyone else and that other people exist only to serve his needs. Jews, minorities, poor people, anyone different from him is subhuman in his worldview. That's textbook psychopathic thinking, where empathy circuits literally don't fire. The Coon episodes show Cartman trying to be a hero, but even then his superhero persona is about control and domination. He doesn't want to help people. He wants to be recognized as superior and have authority over others. When the other kids don't follow his leadership, he turns on them violently. His version of heroism is just another expression of his need to control and hurt people. Throughout the series, Cartman's violence escalates. He starts with verbal cruelty and manipulation, then moves to elaborate schemes, then to causing actual deaths. By later seasons, he's literally committing genocide-level atrocities. The trajectory is clear. Each successful act of cruelty emboldens him to try something worse next time. What makes this terrifying is his age. Cartman is 8 years old and already displaying the full diagnostic criteria for antisocial personality disorder. Most sociopaths don't show this level of calculated cruelty until their teens or 20s. Cartman is ahead of schedule, which suggests he's going to be exceptionally dangerous as an adult. If he's feeding people their parents at age 8, what's he going to do at 18? At 28, Cartman isn't a cartoon villain, he's a realistic portrayal of how sociopaths develop when abuse meets enabling parenting and lack of consequences. His mother's sexual promiscuity exposed him to inappropriate situations that warped his understanding of relationships. Her complete absence of boundaries taught him that rules don't apply to him, and the missing father meant nobody ever corrected these developments. The show is literally documenting a future murderer's childhood. Before we continue, make sure you're subscribed to our channel. Now, let's talk about Kyle's savior complex. What if his constant need to do the right thing isn't actually healthy, but a psychological compulsion that's slowly destroying him? Kyle always needs to be the moral authority in every situation. He can't just let things happen. He has to fix them, explain them, teach everyone the right way to think. Most people would call this being a good person, but watch closer. Kyle doesn't help people because he wants to help. He helps people because he needs to prove he's morally superior. That's not altruism. That's compulsive behavior. His speeches at the end of episodes are the biggest tell. Kyle delivers these moral lessons where he explains what everyone learned, but nobody asked for these speeches. The other kids are ready to move on, but Kyle needs to process everything through his moral framework and announce his conclusions. He's compulsively organizing the world into right and wrong because it's the only way he can feel in control. Smug Alert shows what happens when Kyle's righteousness goes unchecked. He convinces his whole family to move to San Francisco and become insufferably smug about their moral superiority. His need to be right literally destroys his family's life and creates a smug storm that threatens the entire country. But even after all that chaos, Kyle doesn't actually learn to be less self-righteous. He just finds new causes to be right about. The Imagination Land trilogy reveals how obsessive Kyle gets about being correct. He makes a bet with Cartman about leprechauns existing, and when he's proven wrong, he can't let it go. Most people would just pay up and move on, but Kyle turns it into this massive psychological battle where he'd rather go through literal hell than admit Cartman was right about something. That's not normal competitive behavior. That's pathological need to be right. Here's the thing about his relationship with Cartman. They're locked in codependent toxicity where Kyle needs Cartman to be evil so he can be good. Without Cartman as his moral opposite, Kyle's entire identity falls apart. He doesn't actually want Cartman to change or go away, because then he'd lose his purpose. Kyle needs someone to save the world from, which means his heroism is really just feeding his own psychological need for moral superiority. Being Jewish in South Park created this overcompensation. Kyle is the outsider, the religious minority, the one who's different. So he overcompensates by being extra moral, extra right, extra concerned with justice. He's trying to prove that being Jewish doesn't make him less American or less valuable, but this constant proving becomes exhausting and turns into compulsive behavior where he can't stop being the moral voice even when it hurts him. Throughout the series, Kyle's righteousness causes as many problems as it solves. His need to take moral stands disrupts friendships, creates conflicts, and makes situations worse. But he keeps doing it because stopping would mean admitting that maybe he doesn't always have the moral high ground. That admission would destroy his entire sense of self. His rivalry with Cartman is actually making both of them worse. Cartman needs Kyle to torture because it validates his sadistic impulses. Kyle needs Cartman to fight against because it validates his savior complex. They're trapped in this cycle where they make each other more extreme. Without Kyle constantly challenging him, Cartman might get bored and move on. Without Cartman being evil, Kyle would have to find other ways to prove his moral worth. The really twisted part is that Kyle probably knows on some level that his moral crusading is compulsive and unhealthy. But he can't stop because his entire personality is built on being the good kid who does the right thing. Admitting that his righteousness is actually a disorder would mean rebuilding his whole identity from scratch. So he just keeps giving speeches, keeps fighting with Cartman, keeps trying to save people who didn't ask to be saved. He's trapped being morally superior because he needs to be morally superior to feel like he has value. You ever notice how Stan seems more depressed as the series goes on? There's a really dark theory that Stan is developing clinical depression, and we're watching his mental health deteriorate in real time. Early seasons show Stan as relatively normal and emotionally stable, but as the show progresses, he becomes more detached, more cynical, and more exhausted by everything around him. You're Getting Old and Asperger's make this theory explicit. In You're Getting Old, Stan turns 10 years old and suddenly everything he sees and hears literally turns to shit. Music sounds like fart noises. Movies look like someone taking a dump. Food tastes terrible. This isn't just a visual gag. It's a perfect representation of how depression works. When you're depressed, everything that used to bring joy becomes meaningless and unpleasant. The world loses color and becomes one big pile of shit that you have to trudge through every day. The episode shows Stan trying to tell people what's happening, but nobody understands or cares. His friends think he's being weird. His parents are too wrapped up in their own problems to help. Stan is literally experiencing a mental health crisis, and everyone around him just dismisses it as him being difficult. That's depressingly accurate to how kids with depression get treated in real life. Asperger's shows Stan trying to cope with his depression by drinking. He discovers that alcohol makes everything seem normal again. The shit goes away, music sounds good, and life becomes bearable when he's drunk. He's 10 years old and he's already self-medicating with alcohol to manage untreated depression. That's one of the darkest things the show has ever done, and it's played almost completely straight. Think about Stan's home life for a second. Randy is an alcoholic whose behavior gets more erratic and insane with each passing season. Sharon is exhausted and depressed herself from dealing with Randy. Shelley is violent and angry. The Marsh household is completely dysfunctional, and Stan is right in the middle of it, watching his family fall apart while being expected to stay normal and functional. Randy's alcoholism creates an unstable environment where Stan never knows what version of his dad he's going to get. Sometimes Randy is relatively normal. Sometimes he's having a psychotic break about some new obsession. Sometimes he's drunk and making terrible decisions that endanger the family. Stan has to navigate this chaos every single day, which is exactly the kind of environment that causes childhood depression. The Wendy relationship adds another layer of stress. Their relationship is toxic and exhausting. They break up and get back together constantly. Wendy has her own issues and expectations that Stan can't meet. Stan keeps trying to make the relationship work, even though it clearly makes him miserable. He's learned that relationships are supposed to be hard and painful because that's what he sees at home with Randy and Sharon. Look at how Stan's view of the world changes across seasons. Early Stan has hope and enthusiasm. He believes things can get better and that people are basically good. Later seasons, Stan is just tired. He's seen too much, dealt with too much trauma, and watched too many things go wrong. His optimism has been systematically beaten out of him by years of living in South Park's nightmare reality. The cynicism increasing is textbook depression progression. People with untreated depression gradually lose their ability to feel positive emotions. Everything becomes gray and meaningless. Stan used to care about things, used to get excited, used to believe in causes. Now he just goes through the motions because that's what you're supposed to do, not because anything actually matters to him. His role as the normal one makes everything worse. Everyone expects Stan to be the voice of reason, the stable one, the kid who has it together. But that pressure to perform normalcy while internally falling apart is exhausting. Stan can't admit how much he's struggling because everyone needs him to be okay. So he just keeps functioning on the surface while dying inside. What makes this even more disturbing is that nobody in his life recognizes what's happening. Kyle is too focused on his own moral crusades. Cartman obviously doesn't care. Kenny has his own immortality trauma. The adults are all dealing with their own dysfunction. Stan is surrounded by people, but completely alone in his depression, which is exactly how the illness works. The show documents his psychological breakdown without ever really addressing it or getting him help. After the Asperger's arc, things kind of go back to normal, but Stan's underlying depression never actually gets treated. He's just expected to keep functioning with this massive mental health crisis that nobody acknowledged or helped him process. That's horrifyingly realistic to how society treats childhood mental illness. Let's dive into Randy's alcoholism theory. What if his increasingly erratic behavior across the series isn't character development, but realistic progression of alcoholism destroying his brain? Most people laugh at Randy's wacky schemes and ridiculous obsessions, but if you actually track his behavior season by season, you're watching textbook alcoholic brain damage play out in real time. Bloody Mary confirms Randy's alcoholism explicitly. The entire episode is about him getting a DUI, going to AA meetings, and struggling with his drinking problem. He literally admits he's an alcoholic and can't control his relationship with alcohol. But here's what makes this episode so important. After this point, Randy's behavior doesn't get better. It gets progressively worse with each passing season, which is exactly what happens when alcoholics continue drinking after they've been diagnosed. Look at how Randy acts in early seasons versus later seasons. Early Randy is relatively normal. He's got a stable job as a geologist. He makes reasonable decisions most of the time, and his schemes are kind of dumb, but not completely insane. But as the show progresses, Randy becomes more impulsive, more obsessed with random things, and less capable of thinking through consequences. That's not comedy writing. That's accurate portrayal of how chronic alcohol abuse damages the prefrontal cortex and destroys executive function. The progression is scary when you map it out. Randy goes from having one weird obsession per season to being completely controlled by whatever catches his attention. He becomes a celebrity chef. He starts a marijuana farm. He gets obsessed with being a geologist again. He joins cults. He starts feuds with entire countries. Each obsession is more intense and irrational than the last, and he abandons them just as quickly when something new catches his attention. This is textbook alcoholic behavior where impulse control completely breaks down. Sharon's exhaustion throughout the series tells you everything you need to know about what's really happening. She's not just annoyed with Randy's antics. She's a codependent enabler watching her husband destroy himself while she tries to hold the family together. Her reactions get more tired and defeated as the show goes on. Early seasons, Sharon fights with Randy and tries to stop him. Later seasons, Sharon just sighs and accepts whatever insane thing he's doing because she's given up trying to change him. This is exactly how codependent relationships with alcoholics work. The spouse stops fighting and starts enabling because fighting doesn't work. Sharon stays with Randy, makes excuses for his behavior, and tries to minimize the damage to their kids. That's not her being a bad wife. That's her being trapped in a classic codependent pattern where leaving feels impossible and staying means watching someone slowly kill themselves. Randy's schemes getting more dangerous is another huge red flag. Early Randy does embarrassing things that mostly affect himself. Later Randy does genuinely dangerous things that could get people killed. He starts fights, he breaks laws, he puts his family in actual danger. Alcoholics lose their ability to assess risk because alcohol damages the parts of the brain responsible for judgment and self-preservation. Tegrity Farms represents the alcoholic's geographic cure fantasy. Alcoholics often think that changing their environment will fix their drinking problem. If they just move to a new city, start a new job, get away from bad influences, then everything will be fine. But the problem isn't the environment. The problem is the addiction. Randy drags his entire family to a farm thinking this will solve his issues, but he just brings all his problems with him and makes everything worse. The fact that Randy keeps drinking throughout the entire series, despite all the problems it causes, proves he's an addict. Normal people who get a DUI and go to AA either stop drinking or at least cut back significantly. Randy doesn't change at all. He continues drinking and his behavior continues escalating, which means he's physically and psychologically dependent on alcohol to function. Think about what Stan is witnessing at home every single day. His dad is an alcoholic whose behavior gets more erratic and unpredictable with each passing year. Stan never knows which version of Randy he's going to get. Sometimes Randy is relatively normal. Sometimes he's having a complete meltdown over something trivial. Sometimes he's dragging the family into dangerous situations because of whatever he's obsessed with this week. Growing up with an alcoholic parent creates lasting psychological damage, which explains Stan's depression and cynicism. Randy isn't a fun dad having adventures. He's an alcoholic with probable brain damage whose family's trapped watching him destroy himself. Every wacky Randy scheme is actually a symptom of severe addiction that's never addressed or treated. The show documents his decline across hundreds of episodes, and we're supposed to laugh while a man loses his mind to alcohol abuse right in front of us. Here's a disturbing theory about Mr. Garrison. What if all his identity changes and inappropriate behavior with students are actually trauma responses from childhood sexual abuse? Most people watch Mr. Garrison's constant transformations and think it's just South Park being edgy and controversial. But when you look at the pattern of his behavior across the entire series, you're watching a realistic portrayal of how severe childhood trauma creates dissociative identity disorder and leads abuse victims to unconsciously recreate their trauma with new victims. Merry Christmas. Charlie Manson drops a huge hint about Mr. Garrison's past. The episode strongly implies that Mr. Garrison was molested by his father when he was a child. Later, episodes confirm this even more explicitly. Mr. Garrison talks about his dad never showing him affection in ways that clearly indicate something deeply wrong happened in his childhood. When he finally confronts his father about not abusing him, his dad apologizes for not molesting him. That's the show telling us that Mr. Garrison's entire psychology has been warped by childhood sexual trauma. Mr. Hat isn't just a puppet. He's a separate personality that Mr. Garrison created to cope with trauma he couldn't process as a child. When Mr. Garrison uses Mr. Hat, he's literally dissociating and letting this other personality take over. Mr. Hat says and does things that Mr. Garrison claims he can't control. Mr. Hat is violent, inappropriate, and acts out in ways that regular Mr. Garrison supposedly wouldn't. This is textbook dissociative identity disorder, where trauma victims create alternate personalities to handle experiences their main personality can't deal with. Watch how Mr. Garrison behaves when he's using Mr. Hat versus when he's just himself. Mr. Hat comes out during moments of stress, anger, or when Mr. Garrison needs to do something he feels conflicted about. The puppet literally represents a split in his consciousness, where different parts of his personality take control at different times. After enough trauma, especially sexual trauma in childhood, the mind fractures into separate identities as a survival mechanism. Each identity change. Mr. Garrison goes through represents another attempt to escape his trauma. He goes from male to gay, to female, to trans, to back to male again. Every transformation is him trying to find a version of himself that doesn't carry the weight of what happened to him as a child. But the trauma follows him through every identity because you can't run from psychological damage by changing your external presentation. The abuse is embedded in his psyche, regardless of what body or gender he inhabits. What makes this even more disturbing is his job. Mr. Garrison chose to become a teacher, which gives him power and authority over children. Abuse victims who become abusers often gravitate toward positions where they have access to vulnerable people in the same age range as when they were victimized. It's not conscious. It's a compulsion to recreate the dynamics of their original trauma. His behavior towards students throughout the series is wildly inappropriate. He makes sexual comments, shares intimate details about his personal life, crosses boundaries constantly, and seems to have no understanding of proper teacher-student relationships. Normal teachers maintain professional distance. Mr. Garrison treats his classroom like a therapy session where students have to hear about his personal problems and dysfunction. He's projecting his unresolved trauma onto children who have no ability to process or escape it. The really dark part is that Mr. Garrison probably doesn't understand what he's doing. Abuse victims who become abusers often don't recognize the pattern. They genuinely believe they're different from their abusers, that what they're doing isn't harmful because it's not as bad as what happened to them. Mr. Garrison likely thinks his inappropriate behavior with students is harmless compared to the sexual abuse he suffered, but trauma gets passed down through generations and manifests in different ways. His constant need for validation and love makes perfect sense when you understand his background. Children who are sexually abused often develop insatiable needs for affection and attention because they were taught that love comes with abuse. Mr. Garrison jumps from relationship to relationship, desperately seeking someone who will fix the broken parts of himself. But no external relationship can heal internal trauma that's never been addressed. The teaching career also gives him the structure and routine that trauma survivors often need. Standing in front of a classroom, following lesson plans, maintaining the same schedule every day creates predictability in a life that felt chaotic and dangerous during childhood. The irony is that while he's seeking safety through structure, he's creating an unsafe environment for the children in his care by projecting his unresolved issues onto them. Throughout the series, Mr. Garrison shows zero interest in actually helping his students learn or grow. His teaching is perfunctory at best. What he's really doing is working out his own psychological problems in front of captive children who can't leave or set boundaries. Every inappropriate comment, every overshare about his personal life, every breakdown in the classroom is him processing trauma he's never dealt with. The show put an untreated abuse survivor with severe dissociative disorders in charge of children and documented what happens. Mr. Garrison cycles through identities trying to escape his past, acts out inappropriately with students because his understanding of boundaries was destroyed in childhood, and uses his classroom as therapy he desperately needs but never seeks. Every episode with him becomes darker when you realize you're watching an abuse victim become an emotional abuser because nobody ever helped him heal. Before I tell you about the next theory, make sure you're subscribed to our channel. Now let's examine this crazy conspiracy theory. What if everything that happens in South Park, all the aliens, the celebrity visits, the disasters, is actually orchestrated by the government as a social experiment? Think about the town's setup for a minute. South Park is this tiny, isolated mountain town in Colorado that somehow becomes the center of every major weird event that happens in America. That's not coincidence. That's strategic placement. The town's geographic isolation makes it perfect for testing. It's surrounded by mountains, far from major cities, with a small controllable population. If you're the government and you want to study how communities react to extreme situations without the rest of the country finding out, you pick exactly this kind of location. Small enough to monitor everyone, isolated enough that information doesn't spread, and remote enough that you can contain any disasters that happen. Alien encounters happen in South Park constantly. The boys get abducted multiple times. Visitors comes to Earth and interacts with the town. Aliens show up so often that the residents barely react anymore. But here's the thing about those alien encounters. They're always contained to South Park. The rest of the world doesn't seem to know or care that aliens keep visiting this one random Colorado town. Maybe that's because the aliens aren't real. Maybe they're government operatives in costumes running contact scenarios to see how the population responds. Canceled reveals that aliens have been controlling Earth and running experiments on humans for entertainment. The episode literally tells us that everything happening on Earth is being monitored and manipulated by outside forces. What if that's not actually about aliens? What if it's the show telling us that South Park residents are test subjects being watched by the government, and the alien framing is just metaphor for shadowy human organizations? Celebrity deaths are another huge red flag. Famous people visit South Park and die there all the time. But after they die in South Park, nobody in the outside world mentions it. The celebrities just disappear from public life with no media coverage, no investigation, nothing. This suggests either that South Park exists in some kind of separate reality where deaths don't transfer back to the real world, or that the government is using South Park as a witness elimination program. Celebrities who know too much get sent to South Park, where accidents happen and nobody asks questions. Government agents appear throughout the series in ways that seem random, but start forming a pattern when you track them. Men in black show up during alien events. Federal officials arrive during disasters. Secret Service agents monitor situations involving the town. They're always there in the background, watching and documenting, but rarely intervening unless the experiment is about to spiral completely out of control. The reset button mechanic is the smoking gun. Major disasters destroy South Park constantly. The town gets nuked, flooded, invaded, demolished. But by the next episode, everything is rebuilt, and nobody remembers what happened. Normal towns don't have the resources to rebuild from total destruction every few weeks. But a government-funded experiment would have unlimited reconstruction budgets. They just reset the town to baseline conditions and run the next test. Memory wipes explain why residents never learn or grow from their experiences. The same people make the same mistakes over and over because their memories of previous events are being erased. This isn't cartoon logic. This is systematic psychological manipulation where test subjects are kept in a controlled mental state. They remember enough to function day to day, but forget anything that might make them question their reality or try to escape. Real government experiment towns exist in American history. The military has run social experiments on isolated communities before. They've tested biological weapons on unknowing populations. They've monitored how people react to propaganda and fear. South Park residents showing weird mutations and abilities fits perfectly with a long-term exposure study. What happens when you subject a population to constant trauma, bizarre scenarios, and reality-bending events for decades? You get South Park. The town's weird mix of normalcy and impossibility makes sense as a control mechanism. Residents go to work, raise families, and maintain social structures like everything is normal. But underneath the surface, impossible things happen constantly. This creates cognitive dissonance where people know something is wrong but can't articulate what it is. That's intentional. The experimenters want subjects who are confused and pliable, not ones who fully understand their situation. Think about what the government could learn from South Park. How do communities handle political polarization? Put them through extreme partisan conflicts and document the results. How do people respond to celebrity culture? Bring celebrities to town and create scenarios. How does religion affect decision-making during crises? Stage religious events and disasters simultaneously. Every episode could be testing a different hypothesis about human behavior under stress. The residents' acceptance of increasingly bizarre situations shows successful conditioning. Early seasons show characters reacting with appropriate shock to weird events. Later seasons show them barely reacting at all. They've been trained through repeated exposure to accept any reality the experimenters present. That's advanced psychological conditioning that takes years of systematic manipulation to achieve. If South Park residents are unwitting test subjects in ongoing government experiments, then every weird event, every celebrity death, every alien encounter is carefully orchestrated to study human behavior under extreme conditions. They're lab rats who don't even know they're in a cage, living out their lives while researchers document every reaction from hidden observation posts in the surrounding mountains. Let's talk about this twisted theory. What if Satan is actually the most moral character in South Park, and hell is more ethical than Earth? Most depictions of Satan show him as pure evil, the ultimate villain torturing souls for eternity. But South Park's Satan is completely different. He's reasonable, emotionally complex, and genuinely tries to do the right thing. Meanwhile, the humans on Earth are selfish, violent, and cruel to each other constantly. Satan's relationship problems throughout the series reveal way more emotional depth than almost any human character shows. He dates Saddam Hussein and gets trapped in an abusive relationship where Saddam manipulates and controls him. Satan struggles with self-esteem issues, seeks validation, and eventually finds the courage to leave his abuser. That's a realistic portrayal of domestic abuse dynamics. Satan is the victim trying to escape toxicity, not the villain creating it. do the handicapped. Go to Hell shows Satan being completely reasonable about the rules of damnation. When the kids come to Hell worried about their friend Timmy, Satan explains the system calmly and fairly. He's not gleefully torturing people. He's managing a bureaucratic system with clear rules. He even seems sympathetic to the kids' concerns. Compare that to how Earth's religious leaders act in the episode, fighting and arguing about doctrine while Satan just does his job professionally. His relationship with Chris in later episodes shows Satan is capable of genuine love and healthy emotional connection. After escaping Saddam's abuse, Satan finds someone who treats him well and makes him happy. He has normal relationship concerns, normal insecurities, normal desires for commitment and stability. He's more emotionally mature than most of the adult humans in South Park who can't maintain functional relationships. Hell's organization puts Earth's chaos to shame. Hell has clear rules, consistent enforcement, and a hierarchical structure that actually works. Everyone knows what's expected of them. The damned souls are punished according to established guidelines, not arbitrary cruelty. Meanwhile, Earth is complete chaos where rules change randomly, authority figures are corrupt or incompetent, and nobody has any idea what they're supposed to be doing. The damned souls in Hell seem happier than South Park residents in many episodes. They've accepted their fate, they understand the system they're in, and they're not constantly anxious about their existence. Compare that to Earth, where everyone is miserable, fighting with each other and creating new problems constantly. At least Hell is honest about being punishment. Earth pretends to be paradise while being just as bad or worse. Satan's moral code is consistent throughout the series. He follows rules, respects boundaries when asked, and genuinely seems to want people to be happy. When he throws parties or interacts with humans, he's friendly and welcoming. The only time he's antagonistic is when humans summon him for selfish reasons or when he's contractually obligated to do evil things. Left to his own devices, Satan is pretty chill. Heaven barely appears in the show, and when it does, it's portrayed as boring bureaucracy run by incompetent angels. Hell at least has personality and structure. Heaven is just clouds and harps with no substance. The show is telling us that the afterlife's punishment realm has more going for it than the reward realm, which is a pretty dark commentary on religious concepts of justice. Satan choosing to live in hell instead of trying to take over earth or heaven shows he's accepted his role and finds meaning in it. He's not power-hungry or ambitious beyond his station. He manages hell competently and goes home to his personal life. That's more maturity and self-awareness than any human leader in the show demonstrates. The really twisted part is realizing that damnation might be preferable to living in modern society. Hell has clear consequences for clear sins. Earth has random suffering with no explanation or justice. Hell's torture is at least honest and purposeful. Earth's suffering is meaningless and constant. Satan is compassionate and fair within his role. Human leaders are corrupt and cruel while pretending to be good. The show is suggesting that literally going to hell would be better than staying in South Park, and Satan is proof that the devil himself has more humanity than the humans do. Here's a theory that explains everything weird about the boys' behavior. What if they're actually aware they're in a TV show, and that's why they accept all the crazy stuff that happens? Stan, Kyle, Cartman, and Kenny witness murders, alien invasions, supernatural events, and apocalyptic disasters constantly, but they never show lasting trauma. They never need therapy. They just move on to the next episode like nothing happened. That's not resilience. That's genre awareness. The boys reference being in episodes and seasons explicitly throughout the series. They talk about events from previous episodes as if they're reviewing their own show. They make meta comments about plot developments and character arcs. When something ridiculous happens, they sometimes acknowledge how stupid or contrived it is. These aren't just fourth wall breaks for comedy, they're the show telling us that these characters understand they're fictional. Cartoon Wars takes the meta commentary to another level. The boys discuss animation, censorship, and how cartoons work while they're literally inside a cartoon. They debate what's acceptable to show on television while being characters on television. That's not subtle. The episode is explicitly about the boys understanding they exist as entertainment for an audience. Zero trauma from witnessing horrors makes sense when you know you're in a comedy show. Kenny dies constantly, and his friends barely react because they know he'll be back next episode. They've watched him die so many times that death has no meaning anymore. Not because they're desensitized in a realistic way, but because they understand the format. Kenny's deaths are a running gag, and the boys are in on the joke. Their acceptance that nothing permanent changes reveals their understanding of episodic television structure. No matter what happens, South Park resets to baseline by the next episode. The boys know this. They've lived through enough cycles to understand that character development is temporary, consequences are meaningless, and everything goes back to normal. Why be traumatized by events that will be erased from continuity? Direct fourth wall breaks happen regularly. The boys look at the camera, address the audience, or make jokes that only make sense if they know they're being watched. When they do this, they're not confused or surprised. They're comfortable with their existence as entertainment. They've accepted that their lives are performed for viewers. You're getting old shows. Stan becoming aware of something deeply wrong with his reality. Everything turns to literal shit and nothing has meaning anymore. Maybe that's not just depression. Maybe that's Stan's genre awareness becoming too strong and breaking through the show's format. He's realizing that his entire existence is repetitive content creation and that knowledge is destroying his ability to function within the narrative. The boys' lack of PTSD from their experiences is the biggest tell. They've been kidnapped, tortured, nearly killed, and forced to witness atrocities. Normal kids would be completely broken by a fraction of what they've been through. But the boys just keep going to school, hanging out, and having adventures. They can do this because they know none of it is real in the way that would cause lasting psychological damage. Their meta-commentary on plots becomes more frequent in later seasons. They comment on how stupid certain storylines are, how repetitive things have become, or how the show has changed over time. These are observations that only make sense if you're aware you're in a long-running series that's been on the air for decades. Patrick's observation in SpongeBob about "these are some ugly-looking fish" when looking at real humans works the same way in South Park. When the boys encounter the real world or humans from outside their cartoon reality, they recognize the difference. They know they're animated characters in a stylized world that doesn't match actual reality. The boys' awareness explains why they're so jaded and cynical despite being 8 years old. They've lived through hundreds of adventures and know that nothing matters. They're not innocent children anymore because they've seen behind the curtain. They understand they're trapped in an infinite loop of content creation where their suffering and growth are manufactured for entertainment value. Every time they save the town or learn a lesson, they know it's temporary. Every time they think something will change, they know the format won't allow it. They're aware they're fictional characters who will never age, never truly grow, and never escape the narrative structure that defines their existence. That's an existential horror beyond anything else in the show, and they're living it consciously every single day. Let's examine Tweak's paranoia theory. What if Tweak isn't crazy at all, but actually the only person who correctly understands how dangerous South Park really is? Everyone treats Tweak like he's got an anxiety disorder that needs medication and therapy. But when you actually look at what Tweak is afraid of and how often his fears come true, his paranoia stops looking like a disorder and starts looking like appropriate threat assessment. Gnomes proves that some of Tweak's supposedly delusional fears are completely real. The entire episode is about underwear gnomes that Tweak insists are stealing his underwear while he sleeps. Everyone thinks he's crazy. His parents think he's crazy. The other kids think he's crazy. But then they see the gnomes themselves and realize Tweak was right the entire time. His paranoid delusion was actually accurate observation of a real threat that nobody else believed existed. Think about what Tweak has witnessed living in South Park. He's seen his town destroyed multiple times. He's watched people die. He's experienced alien invasions, government conspiracies, and supernatural events. His constant anxiety isn't irrational. It's the only rational response to living in a place where horrible things happen constantly and randomly. The weird part isn't that Tweak is anxious. The weird part is that everyone else isn't. His parents drugging him with coffee is one of the darkest things in the show when you think about it. Tweak versus Craig reveals that his parents have been giving him massive amounts of caffeine since he was a little kid. They run a coffee shop, and they've basically turned their son into an addict to boost their business. They're medicating him with a stimulant that makes anxiety worse, then acting confused about why he's so twitchy and paranoid. That's child abuse disguised as quirky parenting. The coffee addiction explains some of Tweak's symptoms, but it doesn't explain why his fears keep being validated. Throughout the series, Tweak predicts disasters, identifies threats, and recognizes danger before anyone else does. His paranoia has predictive accuracy that goes way beyond random guessing. Maybe his anxiety isn't causing false alarms. Maybe his anxiety is correctly detecting real threats that everyone else is too desensitized to notice. Everyone else's calmness is the real disorder here. The other kids witness the same horrors Tweak does, but they just shrug and move on. That's not healthy coping. That's dangerous desensitization. They've been exposed to so much trauma that their threat detection systems have completely shut down. They can't recognize danger anymore because recognizing every threat would mean constant terror. So their brains just stopped registering threats at all. Tweak maintained his ability to feel appropriate fear while everyone else lost theirs. When something dangerous happens, Tweak's body responds with anxiety and panic, which is what human bodies are supposed to do when facing threats. The other kids' bodies don't respond at all, which means their survival instincts have been damaged by overexposure to danger. His fears being proven right happens too often to be coincidence. The gnomes are real. The threats he identifies turn out to be legitimate. The disasters he predicts actually occur. If Tweak's paranoia was actually a disorder, his fears would be disproportionate to reality. Instead, reality keeps proving that his fears are proportionate or even understated. Tweak isn't disordered. He's the only person in South Park with an appropriate threat assessment system. Everyone else is so desensitized to horror that they can't recognize danger anymore. The fact that his parents are medicating him for being the only rational person shows how backwards the whole town is. They're drugging the kid who correctly perceives reality and celebrating the kids who've lost all normal fear responses. Be sure to subscribe to our channel. Now let's dive into this theory about disability representation. What if Timmy and Jimmy together show how society treats disabled people, either as incomprehensible others or as inspirational performers? South Park has two main disabled characters, and the way the town treats each of them reveals completely different expectations based on how well they can perform normalcy for abled people. Timmy rarely gets translated or understood by other characters. His vocabulary is limited to saying his own name and a few other words. Most of the time, other characters just accept that they can't understand him and move on. The show presents this as comedy, but it's actually showing how society handles disabled people whose communication doesn't fit standard expectations. When someone can't communicate in ways that abled people find accessible, they just get ignored or treated as incomprehensible. Timmy 2000 shows the only time Timmy gets widely accepted and celebrated by the town. He joins a band called the Lords of the Underworld and becomes a rock star. Suddenly everyone loves Timmy and thinks he's amazing. But notice what changed. Timmy didn't change. His disability didn't change. What changed is that he's now entertaining abled people. He's providing value in a way they understand and enjoy. The town only accepts his disability when it comes packaged as performance they can consume. Jimmy represents the opposite approach to disability. He's constantly performing. His entire identity is built around being a comedian who makes jokes about his own stuttering and disability. The town accepts Jimmy more readily than Timmy because Jimmy has learned to make his disability palatable. Through humor, he's doing the emotional labor of making abled people comfortable with his existence by turning it into entertainment. The difference in how they're treated is stark. Timmy gets ignored, dismissed, or tokenized. Jimmy gets included, celebrated and treated almost like a normal kid. But that inclusion comes at a cost. Jimmy has to constantly perform, constantly be funny, constantly make his disability into something that benefits other people. He can't just exist. He has to justify his existence by being inspirational or entertaining. Jimmy's comedy career isn't just a character trait, it's survival strategy. Kids with disabilities learn early that if they can make abled people laugh or feel good, they get treated better. Jimmy has weaponized this dynamic by becoming a professional comedian, but that means his entire social acceptance is conditional on his ability to perform. If he stops being funny, does he stop being valued? Both characters show how abled people control disabled narratives. Timmy's story gets told by other people because he can't articulate it in ways they understand. Jimmy's story gets told through his comedy, but that comedy is shaped by what abled audiences want to hear. Neither character gets authentic self-representation. They only get the versions of themselves that abled society finds acceptable. The show never explores what Timmy and Jimmy think about their own disabilities. We only see how other characters react to them. That's the point. Disabled people in society are constantly defined by how abled people perceive them, not by their own self-understanding. Timmy and Jimmy exist in the show primarily as objects that other characters react to, not as fully developed subjects with their own internal lives. Timmy being non-verbal means most of his storylines center on other people's perceptions and projections. He becomes whatever the abled characters need him to be in any given moment. Sometimes he's a source of inspiration. Sometimes he's a problem to solve. Sometimes he's comic relief. But he's rarely just a person existing without having to represent something for abled viewers. Jimmy's stuttering becomes his defining feature that everything else about him gets filtered through. He can't just tell a joke. He has to tell a joke about being disabled while stuttering. His disability becomes the lens through which all his actions are interpreted, which is exactly how society treats disabled people. They can never just be people. They have to be disabled people performing their disability in specific ways. The theory suggests South Park isn't mocking disabled people. It's showing how society forces disabled people into narrow, acceptable roles. You can be the incomprehensible other like Timmy, or you can be the performing inspiration like Jimmy, but you can't just be a person with a disability who exists without having to constantly manage abled people's feelings about your existence. You ever notice how Token's name literally describes his role? There's a dark theory that Token's entire existence is commentary on how society isolates black people through tokenism, and his wealth makes it worse, not better. The show even changed his name to Tolkien in later seasons, but that doesn't fix the fundamental issue. His character is still about being the singular black kid who has to represent his entire race. Christian Rock Hard has one of the most revealing moments about Token's experience. Cartman assumes Token can play bass guitar just because he's black. Token insists he doesn't know how to play bass, but when he picks up the instrument, he can actually play it perfectly. The joke seems like it's mocking Token for conforming to a stereotype. But the real darkness is that Token has internalized racist expectations so deeply that he's surprised by his own abilities. Society told him what black people are supposed to be good at, and his identity has been shaped by those expectations, whether he wanted them or not. His position in the friend group shows his isolation perfectly. Stan, Kyle, and Cartman have this core dynamic that Token is never really part of. He's there, he participates, but he's always slightly outside the main trio. He's included enough that the show can claim diversity, but not integrated enough to be essential. That's literally what tokenism means. You include one person from a minority group so you can say you're inclusive, but you don't actually integrate them fully into the structure. The wealth factor makes Token's isolation even more complex. Here Comes the Neighborhood shows other rich black families moving to South Park, and Token is excited to finally have community. But the episode frames the wealthy black families as invaders who don't belong. Token's family being rich doesn't protect him from racism. It actually makes him a tool for racists to use as proof that racism doesn't exist. Look at Token, he's successful. So clearly the system works fine. Token's family being the exception that proves the rule is incredibly dark. White people in South Park point to the blacks being wealthy as evidence that there's no systemic racism. If Token's family can succeed, then any failure by other black people must be their own fault, right? That's exactly how tokenism functions in real society. One successful person from a marginalized group gets used to dismiss the struggles of everyone else from that group. Throughout the series, Token is forced to explain and represent black culture to white characters who assume he's an authority on everything related to black people. He has to speak for his entire race in a way that white characters never have to. Kyle doesn't have to explain all Jewish culture every episode. Stan doesn't have to represent all white people, but Token is constantly put in the position of being the black ambassador to South Park. His isolation from potential community is the cruelest part. Where are the other black families? Why is Token the only black kid in his class for most of the series? The show acknowledges this isolation but frames it as Token's individual problem rather than a structural issue. He's disconnected from black community and culture, but he's also never fully accepted into white South Park society. He exists in this liminal space where he belongs nowhere. The wealth his family has should theoretically give him power and security, but it doesn't protect him from racist assumptions. It doesn't give him community. It doesn't make him less isolated. If anything, being rich makes him more useful as a token because he can't complain about economic oppression. His family's success gets weaponized against other black people while not actually making Token's life better in terms of belonging and acceptance. Token's friends constantly make racist assumptions about him, and he's expected to just accept it or educate them. He has to do the emotional labor of explaining why their assumptions are wrong, teaching them about racism, and forgiving them when they mess up. That's exhausting work that he has to do constantly just to maintain friendships with people who see him as fundamentally different. His name being a literal description of his role in the show is the smoking gun. The creators named him Token Black because that's what he is. A token black character included for diversity without actual integration or depth. Later, changing it to Tolkien doesn't erase that original truth. It just adds a layer of plausible deniability while keeping the same dynamic. Token deserves to just be a kid with his own personality, interests, and storylines that have nothing to do with race. Instead, almost every Token storyline centers on him being black and what that means in white South Park. He can't escape being defined by his race, and his isolation is the price he pays for being the exception in a system designed to exclude people who look like him. Let's talk about Wendy's feminist burnout. What if her character evolution shows how fighting for equality in a toxic environment slowly destroys even the strongest activists? Early seasons. Wendy is this fierce feminist who stands up for women's rights and calls out sexism whenever she sees it. But as the show progresses, she gives up more and more often until she's barely fighting at all. Bebe's boobs destroy society shows early Wendy at her most analytical and feminist. When all the boys become obsessed with Baby because she's developing breasts, Wendy is the only one who recognizes what's happening and tries to explain it. She talks about biological drives and social conditioning. She's aware, articulate, and trying to educate people about sexism. This is Wendy before the burnout really sets in. Breast cancer show. Ever reveals how exhausted she's become. After years of trying to reason with Cartman and explain why his misogyny is wrong, Wendy finally snaps and just beats him up. She doesn't try to educate him anymore. She doesn't attempt dialogue or reasoning. She resorts to violence because that's the only language he understands. This episode shows Wendy realizing that all her feminist arguments and explanations have accomplished nothing. Sometimes the only response left is physical force. Her relationship with Stan represents compromising feminist values for social acceptance. Wendy is smarter and more politically aware than Stan, but she constantly dumbs herself down to maintain their relationship. She knows Stan doesn't really understand or support her feminist views, but she stays with him anyway because being alone is scarier than compromising. That's a realistic portrayal of how many feminists end up in relationships that don't align with their values because societal pressure to couple up is overwhelming. The pattern across seasons is clear. Early Wendy fights every instance of sexism she encounters. Middle seasons, Wendy picks her battles more carefully. Later seasons, Wendy mostly just sighs and lets things happen. She's being worn down by the constant resistance she faces every time she tries to address inequality. Nobody wants to hear it. Nobody changes. So why keep fighting? Her struggles never create lasting change, which is the most depressing part. Wendy can win individual battles like beating up Cartman or calling out specific instances of sexism, but the overall culture of South Park Elementary never improves. The boys keep being misogynist. The school keeps perpetuating gender stereotypes. Nothing Wendy does makes a permanent difference, and she knows it. List Wendy still trying to organize and resist in ways that male characters don't. When she sees injustice, she still feels compelled to act, even though she knows it's probably futile. That compulsion to keep fighting, even after you've lost hope, is what feminist burnout looks like. You're so conditioned to resist that you can't stop even when you know resistance is pointless. The show documents her slow realization that nothing she does will create lasting change. Every feminist victory is temporary. Every time she thinks progress has been made, the boys just revert to their old behavior. She's fighting a war she can't win because the system is designed to exhaust resistors until they give up. And that's exactly what's happening to her across the series. Wendy's arc suggests that fighting misogyny in environments that refuse to change doesn't make you a hero, it just makes you tired. The optimistic early seasons Wendy, who believed education and activism could create change, gradually transforms into exhausted later seasons. Wendy who knows better but hasn't figured out how to stop caring. That's darker than any violent or shocking moment because it's showing the death of hope in real time. Here's a disturbing theory about South Park Elementary. What if the school is deliberately designed to fail students and perpetuate cycles of trauma and dysfunction? Look at every single adult who works there. Every teacher is either incompetent, abusive, or completely checked out. There's zero counseling or mental health resources despite students experiencing constant trauma. The administration allows bullying, violence, and dangerous situations to happen without consequences. This isn't accidental institutional failure. This is systematic training for lives of dysfunction. Mr. Garrison is sexually inappropriate with students, projects his personal trauma onto them, and teaches almost nothing of educational value. His classroom is where he works out his psychological issues in front of captive children. Mr. Mackey is supposed to be the school counselor, but he's a recovering addict whose only solution to every problem is blaming drugs. He provides zero actual mental health support. He just runs anti-drug propaganda sessions that don't address students' real emotional needs. Chef was the only positive adult figure in the entire school, and they killed him off. Before Chef died, he was the one person students could talk to who would listen without judgment and actually try to help. He provided emotional support, gave advice, and created a safe space. The school removed him and replaced him with nobody. After Chef's death, students have literally no trusted adults to turn to when they're struggling. PC Principal represents violent enforcement of social rules without any understanding of why those rules exist. He beats up students who say politically incorrect things. He uses physical intimidation to control behavior. His method of addressing social issues is brutality, which teaches students that problems get solved through violence and fear rather than education and understanding. That's creating the next generation of authoritarians who think might makes right. The school allows Cartman to terrorize other students for years without meaningful intervention. He's racist, violent, manipulative, and cruel. Any functional school would have expelled him or gotten him serious psychological help. Instead, they just let him keep attending and victimizing everyone around him. The message this sends is that abusers face no consequences, which conditions victims to accept abuse as normal. Dangerous situations happen constantly at South Park Elementary without any adult intervention, students get into fights, they're exposed to traumatic events, they witness violence and death. The school's response is basically nothing. No trauma counseling, no safety improvements, no acknowledgement that these children need support. The institution just expects kids to process horrors on their own and keep showing up to class like everything is fine. The curriculum seems designed to waste time rather than educate. Students aren't learning critical thinking, emotional regulation, or practical life skills. They're being taught to sit still, follow orders, and regurgitate information. This creates adults who can't think independently, can't manage their emotions, and can't function effectively in society, which means they'll need the same support systems and fail in the same ways their parents did. Compare South Park Elementary to functional schools. Real schools have counselors who actually counsel. They have protocols for bullying and violence. They fire teachers who are inappropriate with students. They provide mental health resources. They teach actual skills. South Park Elementary does none of this. The absence of basic institutional competence isn't accidental. It's systematic preparation for dysfunction. Think about what these kids are actually learning at school. They're learning that adults can't be trusted. They're learning that institutions don't protect you. They're learning that violence is how problems get solved. They're learning that speaking up about abuse gets you ignored or punished. They're learning that emotional needs don't matter. These aren't lessons that create healthy, functional adults. These are lessons that create the next generation of South Park residents who will perpetuate the same cycles. The school's failure to address students' trauma is particularly cruel. These kids witness murders, experience disasters, and face constant danger. Normal schools would provide immediate crisis counseling. South Park Elementary acts like nothing happened and expects students to just deal with it. This teaches children that their emotional responses to trauma are invalid and that they need to suppress their feelings to be acceptable. Every institution in South Park is dysfunctional, but the elementary school is where that dysfunction gets created. The kids enter relatively innocent and leave damaged by years of institutional neglect and abuse. The school isn't trying to educate them. It's training them to accept dysfunction as normal, so they'll grow up to be dysfunctional adults who raise dysfunctional children who attend the same failing school. It's a perfect system for ensuring nothing ever improves and every generation inherits the trauma of the previous one. Let's examine Mr. Mackey's drug hypocrisy theory. What if his obsessive anti-drug messaging is actually projection from his own addiction and recovery struggles? You ever notice how Mr. Mackey blames literally everything on drugs? Student having behavioral problems, drugs, kid failing classes, drugs, someone feeling sad, drugs. His entire counseling philosophy centers on anti-drug propaganda while ignoring every other issue students face. Ike's Wee Wee reveals the truth about Mr. Mackey's obsession. He gets fired for having marijuana in his office, starts using drugs himself, and quickly spirals into full addiction. The episode shows him becoming homeless, desperate, and completely consumed by substance abuse. This isn't just a one-time storyline. This is the show telling us that Miss Mackey has personal experience with addiction, which explains his pathological focus on drugs as the root of all problems. His verbal tic makes more sense when you understand it as a recovery marker. The constant "Mackay" is a self-soothing behavior, a way to stay grounded and remind himself to stay calm. Recovering addicts often develop these kinds of verbal patterns as coping mechanisms. Every MK is Mr. Mackey managing his own anxiety about staying sober. Counselor positions often attract recovering addicts who want to help others avoid their mistakes. That's not necessarily bad, except Mr. Mackey took a counseling job without actually learning how to counsel. He has one tool in his toolbox, which is telling people drugs are bad. He can't address emotional issues, family problems, trauma, or mental health because he never learned those skills. He just knows addiction firsthand and projects that experience onto every student issue. His obsession suggests he's still fighting his own demons. Normal counselors who've recovered from addiction can talk about other issues. Mr. Mackey literally cannot. Every conversation circles back to drugs because that's what he's thinking about constantly. He's running his own recovery program by repeatedly convincing himself and others that drugs are bad. Each anti-drug assembly is him reinforcing his own sobriety. The lack of actual counseling skills becomes obvious when students come to him with real problems. He has no therapeutic techniques. He doesn't listen actively. He doesn't help students process emotions or develop coping strategies. He just launches into anti-drug speeches regardless of what the actual issue is. A kid could come in saying their parents are getting divorced, and Mr. Mackey would somehow make it about drugs. Throughout the series, Mr. Mackey shows signs of someone white-knuckling sobriety without actually addressing underlying issues. He's not in therapy himself. He hasn't dealt with whatever drove him to use drugs originally. He's just not using while being constantly terrified of relapse. That fear manifests as obsessive preaching about how drugs destroy lives. His failures as a counselor directly harm students who need real help. Kids experiencing depression, anxiety, trauma, and abuse come to his office and get lectured about drugs instead of receiving actual support. The school hired a recovering addict with zero counseling training and put him in charge of students' mental health. Every kid who leaves his office without real help is evidence of how institutions fail children by prioritizing optics over actual care. Officer Barbrady's illiteracy isn't just a character quirk. It's commentary on how police departments hire and protect incompetent officers who endanger communities. Think about what it means that Barbrady became a cop despite being unable to read. Police work requires reading reports, understanding laws, processing paperwork, and communicating through written documentation. How did someone who literally cannot read get hired, trained, and kept on the force? Chicken Lover reveals Barbrady's illiteracy when he has to admit he can't read the criminal's taunting messages. The entire town is shocked, but then they just move on. Nobody asks how this happened. Nobody demands accountability from whoever hired him. The system protected an incompetent officer for years, and even after his incompetence gets exposed, he faces no real consequences. His inability to read has caused real harm throughout his career. How many crime scenes did he mishandle because he couldn't read evidence? How many reports did he file incorrectly? How many legal procedures did he mess up? Every time Barbrady failed at his job, real people got hurt or criminals went free. But the department kept him employed anyway because firing bad cops is apparently harder than letting them keep causing damage. The pattern of police protecting incompetent and dangerous officers is exactly what we see with Barbrady. He's clearly unqualified. Everyone knows it, but the institution closes ranks and keeps him on the force because admitting they hired someone who can't read would make the department look bad. Better to keep a dangerous officer employed than admit the screening process failed catastrophically. Barbrady represents systemic police incompetence where departments prioritize protecting their own over protecting communities. Normal police departments would never hire someone who can't read. They screen for basic competencies because lives depend on officers doing their jobs correctly. South Park's police department either never screened Barbrady at all, or they knew he couldn't read and hired him anyway. Both options are horrifying. His continued employment after his illiteracy becomes public knowledge shows how hard it is to remove bad cops. Even with obvious documented incompetence, Barbrady keeps his job. The system is designed to protect officers from consequences, even when those officers are actively making their communities less safe through sheer incompetence. Real police screening failures happen constantly. Departments hire officers with violent histories, psychological problems, and incompetence issues. Then they protect these officers when their failures become public. Barbrady is South Park's version of this systemic problem where the institution's reputation matters more than community safety. Let's talk about Mayor McDaniel's corruption. What if every disaster and weird event in South Park benefits her financially and politically, and she's orchestrating it all? Most people assume she's just an incompetent mayor who keeps getting reelected despite constant failures. But when you track who profits from South Park's chaos, it's always her. Every crisis that hits South Park somehow ends with McDaniels consolidating more power or making more money. The town gets destroyed and needs rebuilding. Who controls the reconstruction contracts? The mayor. Weird events attract media attention and tourism. Who benefits from increased revenue? The mayor's office. Disasters create emergencies that require expanded government authority. Who gets that authority? Mayor McDaniels. She gets reelected constantly despite being terrible at her job. South Park experiences more disasters per capita than any town in America, yet residents keep voting for the same mayor who's been in charge during all of them. That's not voter stupidity, that's systematic manipulation of elections. McDaniels has figured out how to maintain power regardless of her performance because she's created a system where she's the only option that makes sense to confused, traumatized voters. Her relationship with various corrupt enterprises throughout the series shows she's connected to everything shady happening in town. Whenever there's a scheme to exploit residents or a plot to make money off South Park's weirdness, you can trace connections back to the mayor's office. She might not be the mastermind behind every plot, but she's definitely profiting from all of them. The town's dysfunction directly serves her political interests. When residents are constantly dealing with crises, they don't have time to organize against her. They're too busy trying to survive disasters to question why those disasters keep happening under the same leadership. Chaos is her greatest political tool because it keeps people desperate for any authority figure who claims to have control. Episodes showing her making decisions reveal she prioritizes money and power over residents' safety every single time. When faced with choices between protecting citizens and profiting from their suffering, she chooses profit. When disasters create opportunities for graft, she takes them. She's not incompetent, she's strategically corrupt. Her connections to businesses that benefit from South Park's tourist economy are particularly telling. The town's reputation for weird events attracts visitors, which generates revenue. McDaniels has financial interest in maintaining South Park's status as the center of bizarre happenings. She needs the chaos to continue because that's what brings money and attention to her administration. Real corrupt small-town mayors operate exactly like this. They create systems where they profit from their town's problems while appearing to address those problems. They maintain power through a combination of voter manipulation, corrupt connections, and ensuring no legitimate opposition can emerge. McDaniels is a textbook example of this kind of systematic corruption. She enables problems that she can then claim to solve. Cartman causes chaos, and McDaniels swoops in to restore order while expanding government power. Disasters destroy property, and she controls reconstruction while taking cuts from contractors. Celebrity scandals bring media attention, and she positions herself as the town's spokesperson while building her political brand. Every episode where something goes wrong in South Park creates an opportunity for Mayor McDaniels to consolidate power, make money, or both. She's not failing at her job. Her job is to maintain a system where she profits from South Park's dysfunction, while keeping residents too traumatized and confused to realize they're being exploited by their own government. Section 20. Here's a theory about Terrence and Phillip. What if their crude show represents how media corporations use lowest common denominator content to keep populations distracted and stupid? The parents in South Park blame Terrence and Phillip for corrupting their children, but they're attacking the wrong target. The real issue isn't crude entertainment. It's passive media consumption creating populations that don't think critically. South Park. Bigger, longer, and uncut makes this explicit with the entire Blame Canada premise. Parents refuse to take responsibility for their own failures and instead scapegoat foreign entertainment. Sheila Broflovsky leads a crusade against Terrence and Phillip because admitting that she's failed as a parent is harder than blaming Canadian fart jokes. This is exactly how moral panics work in real life. The show is no worse than South Park itself. That's the point. Parents who let their kids watch South Park are outraged by Terrence and Phillip, even though both shows have similar content. The hypocrisy reveals that the issue isn't actually about protecting children. It's about finding convenient scapegoats for societal problems that parents don't want to address. Terrence and Philip being Canadian represents foreign influence fears that have existed forever. America has always been paranoid about outside corruption of its youth. Rock music from Britain, anime from Japan, video games from everywhere. Terrence and Philip are just the latest version of this xenophobic panic, where foreign entertainment gets blamed for domestic failures. The real danger of Terrence and Philip isn't their content, it's that kids watch passively instead of engaging critically. But that's true of all media, including the news, political content, and educational programming. The problem is consumption without thinking, not fart jokes specifically. Parents focus on crude content because it's visible and shocking, while ignoring the actual harm of media teaching kids not to question what they're watching. Blame Canada shows how societies avoid addressing real issues by creating moral panics about entertainment. Instead of examining why kids are drawn to crude humor, why parents aren't supervising media consumption, or why schools aren't teaching critical thinking, everyone just attacks the show. It's easier to ban Terrence and Philip than to actually parent or fix systemic problems. The kids aren't actually corrupted by Terrence and Philip. They were already swearing and misbehaving. The show just gave parents a convenient excuse for behaviors that existed before. This is the classic moral panic pattern where society identifies a scapegoat for problems it doesn't want to solve through actual policy changes or cultural shifts. Media effects research consistently shows that content doesn't create behavior in isolation. Kids who watch violent content don't automatically become violent. Kids who watch crude content don't automatically become crude. Behavior is influenced by environment, parenting, education, and peer groups far more than by entertainment. But blaming entertainment lets parents and institutions off the hook for their own failures. The meta commentary cuts deep because South Park is critiquing itself through Terrence and Philip. The show is saying that people who watch South Park and clutch pearls about crude content elsewhere are missing the point entirely. All of it is just entertainment. The real issue is whether consumers think critically about what they're watching or just absorb messages passively. You ever notice how South Park treats Canadians? There's a theory that the show's portrayal of Canadians represents American xenophobia and how immigrants get blamed for social problems they didn't cause. Every time something goes wrong in South Park, Canadians are convenient scapegoats. The physical differences, the wall building, the stereotypes, it's all immigration commentary disguised as jokes about our northern neighbors. Where My Country Gone makes the parallel explicit. The episode is basically about Trump's border wall rhetoric, but with Canada instead of Mexico. South Park builds a literal wall to keep Canadians out because residents blame them for taking jobs and changing their culture. This is exactly how anti-immigrant sentiment works. Take economic anxiety caused by systemic issues and redirect it toward foreigners who are easier to hate than complex policy failures. Canadians in South Park look physically different from Americans. They have different mouth animations, speak differently, and are immediately recognizable as other. This visual othering is how societies mark immigrants as fundamentally different and therefore threatening. It doesn't matter that Canadians and Americans are culturally similar in reality. The show exaggerates differences to demonstrate how othering works. Blame Canada from the movie shows how xenophobia operates through scapegoating. When South Park parents can't control their kids or face their own parenting failures, they blame Canadian entertainment. It's not their fault their kids are misbehaving. It's those corrupting foreign influences. This is the exact logic used against immigrant communities. Crime rates go up? Blame immigrants. Economy struggles? Blame immigrants. Social problems exist? Must be the foreigner's fault. Ike's adoption storyline adds another dimension. He's a Canadian immigrant who gets adopted by an American family and grows up trying to fit in. He faces constant reminders that he's different, that he doesn't really belong. His brother Kyle protects him, but that protection is necessary because Ike is vulnerable as an outsider. This is the immigrant child experience where you're raised in a culture that constantly reminds you that you're not fully American. The show uses Canadian stereotypes the same way real xenophobia uses immigrant stereotypes. All Canadians are polite, all say a boot, all have the same mannerisms. This flattening of an entire nationality into simple stereotypes is exactly how racism and xenophobia function. It strips individuals of complexity and makes an entire group into cartoon characters who can be easily dismissed or mocked. Episodes where Canadians move to South Park show native residents feeling threatened by demographic change. The town's culture is supposedly being destroyed by Canadian influence. This is white replacement theory dressed up as comedy. The fear that immigrants will change or destroy American culture is a foundational xenophobic belief, and South Park demonstrates how that fear manifests in communities. Real immigration scapegoating follows the exact pattern shown with Canadians. Economic problems? Blame them for taking jobs. Crime? Must be the immigrants. Cultural change? Those foreigners are ruining our traditional values. It doesn't matter if the data shows immigrants contribute positively to economies and commit crimes at lower rates than native-born citizens. Xenophobia isn't based on facts. It's based on fear and the need for convenient scapegoats. The wall represents every barrier societies build to keep immigrants out. Physical walls, legal barriers, cultural exclusion, economic discrimination. South Park building a wall to stop Canadians mirrors America's ongoing immigration debates, where walls are presented as solutions to problems that walls can't solve. But walls make xenophobes feel safer, even if they don't actually address underlying issues. Canadian characters being blamed for things they didn't do is particularly telling. When problems exist in South Park, adding Canadians to the situation makes them easy targets, even when Americans cause the problems. Ike's story shows how immigrant children suffer from xenophobia despite being innocent. He didn't choose to be Canadian. He didn't choose to immigrate, but he faces consequences because of where he was born and how others perceive him. Be sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this. Now let's dive into the most disturbing relationship theory. What if Leanne and Cartman are locked in severe codependency where they're destroying each other psychologically and it will end in tragedy? Most people laugh at their dynamic as comedy about a permissive parent and bratty kid, but watch how they actually interact across the series, and you're seeing textbook codependent dysfunction where both are trapped in mutually assured destruction. Leanne's sex work creates this weird dynamic where she's trying to buy Cartman's love through material goods. She doesn't know how to parent with authority or boundaries, so she substitutes gifts and permissiveness. Every time Cartman demands something, she gives it to him immediately. Not because she's generous, but because she's desperately afraid he'll reject her if she says no. That's codependent thinking where your entire self-worth depends on someone else's approval. This shows what happens when Leanne tries to set boundaries. She hires the dog whisperer who teaches her proper discipline techniques. For the first time ever, she's successfully parenting Cartman. He's actually behaving and following rules, but Leanne sabotages the whole thing because she can't handle not being needed as the permissive enabler. She undermines the dog whisperer's work because her identity is built on being the mom who gives Cartman everything he wants. Her inability to say no isn't kindness. It's pathological fear of abandonment. Leanne is terrified that if she acts like a real parent with rules and consequences, Cartman will stop loving her. She'd rather let him become a monster than risk losing his affection. That's codependency, where you enable destructive behavior because preventing it might mean losing the relationship. Cartman has weaponized his mother's codependency into a tool for total control. He knows exactly how to manipulate her guilt, her fears, and her desperate need for his approval. He spent his entire life learning which buttons to push to get what he wants. By the time we see them in the show, Cartman is a master manipulator, and Leanne is completely under his control despite theoretically being the authority figure. Cartman's mom is a dirty slut reveals the depths of her dysfunction. The town knows about her sexual history and judges her harshly. She's internalized that shame and uses Cartman as proof that she's a good person despite her past. If she can be a great mom, then maybe she's not the person everyone says she is. But her desperation to prove she's a good mother makes her an enabler who's actually creating a sociopath. The manipulation goes both ways, which is what makes it codependency instead of just abuse. Leanne isn't just a victim, she's actively participating in this dysfunction because she needs Cartman as much as he manipulates her. She could set boundaries, she could get therapy, she could change the dynamic, but that would require admitting their relationship is sick, and she can't face that truth. Throughout the series, Leanne's self-esteem gets lower while Cartman's entitlement grows. That's the codependency death spiral. The more she enables, the worse he behaves. The worse he behaves, the more desperate she becomes to make him happy. The more desperate she becomes, the more he exploits her. They're locked in a cycle that escalates with every rotation. Her loneliness drives everything. Cartman is her only real relationship. She doesn't have friends, doesn't have a stable partner, doesn't have family support. All her emotional needs get funneled into her relationship with her son, which is way too much pressure for any relationship to handle. She needs Cartman to be everything: son, companion, validation of her worth as a person. No kid should carry that burden. Cartman has learned that love means manipulation. His mother taught him that affection is transactional, that getting what you want is more important than healthy relationships, and that other people exist to serve your needs. These are lessons that will destroy every relationship he ever has. But Leanne can't teach him anything different because she doesn't know anything different herself. What makes this truly disturbing is that both of them are victims of their codependency, but both are also perpetrators. Leanne created Cartman's sociopathy through enabling. Cartman exploits his mother's psychological vulnerabilities deliberately. Neither can escape without the other changing, but neither can change without outside intervention that never comes. They're destroying each other slowly, and the show documents this mutual destruction across hundreds of episodes while we laugh at their dysfunction.